She said it was just another client dinner at the Seaforth on South Tryon, the kind with comped wine and a receipt shoved into a leather folio. But the second I texted, "Enjoy the lobster. Tell Chris I still want my shirt back," the room in our house went cold like a walk-in freezer, and my phone lit up so fast it burned. I heard nothing from the TV anymore, nothing from our street in Dilworth, only her frantic call vibrating in my palm while the image of my blue Oxford, the one Chris borrowed at Lake Norman last fall, flashed behind my eyes like a strobe. And that's when I understood. This wasn't about dinner. It was about a hidden bill I was already paying. I didn't answer right away. I let it ring twice more, let the panic do its work on her end. When I picked up, her voice was too bright and too brittle, like glass held over a flame. "Where are you?" she asked. "In the kitchen," I said. "Where are you?" "At the Seaforth," she said like it was news. "Clients. We talked about this. We talked about Tuesday," I said. "Today is Thursday." Silence. Not empty, but weighted, like a hand pressing down on the middle of my chest. I looked at the small notepad I kept for estimates and job hours and wrote the date, March 9th, 2023. After I hung up, I wanted that date to have a line under it. She tried to slide out of it with a laugh. "You and your calendars. Tell Chris I still want my shirt back," I said, and listened to the sound of her breath. It stumbled. Then the volume in the background dropped as if a phone had been cupped by a hand. "What does Chris have to do with anything?" she asked too slow. "He borrows things and forgets he borrowed them," I said. "Shirts, tools, sometimes people." The line went silent again, but this time it wasn't a stall, it was a calculation. I pictured her eyes cutting sideways at a table companion and the sweep of a gray napkin over a white plate. "You're being weird," she said. "I'll be home late." "Don't forget a receipt," I said. "Work likes receipts." She hung up first. That told me more than her words did. I set my phone face down and stood at the sink, hands braced on the counter, the tile cool under my bare feet, the clock over the stove ticking loud enough to count the seconds sliding off my life. I tried to breathe, but the air felt heavy, like it had absorbed the smell of burned sugar. We were 6 years into the mortgage on the greenhouse with the black shutters, and I had put in the oak shelves with my own hands. I had painted the front door that flat marine blue because she said it looked like calm water. I knew the weight of that door when it closed and the sound it made when someone lied on the other side of it. The next thing I did was pull open the drawer where we kept warranties and manuals, furnace, dishwasher, dryer, and slid out a plastic envelope. Inside were two things I never thought I'd need at the same time: my marriage license and a small spiral notebook I'd labeled Taxes, 2023. I wasn't going after her heart, I was going after math. I build budgets for a living. Commercial fit-outs, electrical bids, change orders. I sleep best when the numbers balance. Ariel, my wife, lived in the world of marketing, launched dinners, client decks, glossy language, and expenses written in neat italic. Chris ran accounts above her, always the one to clap the bartender on the shoulder and call it networking. The shirt he borrowed? He'd spilled Merlot on his at a lake rental, and I gave him mine from my go bag. The way he joked that night about keeping it because it made him look honest clung to me like smoke. I opened our shared credit card app and scrolled. At 6:41 p.m., there it was, the Seaforth, $238.72, 2 martinis on the pre-auth. I screen-capped it and moved to my banking app, to the checking account we shared for household bills. The thrum in my left temple ticked in time with the Face ID squares unlocking like falling doors. I didn't need a PI. I needed receipts, timestamps, and a reason someone would lie about a shirt. At 8:12 p.m., there was a second line from the Seaforth, $314.98. That's lobster, wine upgrade, and someone deciding not to feel guilty. My jaw rolled tight. I walked into the spare room, what Ariel called the reading room and what I had started jokingly calling the evidence locker, and pulled a banker's box from the closet. Inside were old paper statements, a handful of expense reports she'd asked me to scan back in December, and a photo strip from the office winter party where Chris's tie was around his head like a belt. But then, halfway down the stack, I found an email printout with a handwritten note from Ariel. "Can you scan this for me? Need to submit by end of day." It was an expense report with a merchant I recognized, Lark and Ledger, because that was where she'd bought me cufflinks for the wedding. The line item, client gift, bottle of Angel's Envy. The date was November 18. The receipt number was 2749. The last 4 card digits didn't match her corporate card. They matched ours. My chest tightened, not with romance but with arithmetic. She'd been floating client expenses on our personal account, likely to skim points, likely to submit to the company for reimbursement, and then, what? Pay our card back on autopilot when the reimbursement hit, or forget. I checked the payment for that date. No matching deposit from her company within 5 days. I wrote, November 18th, 2749, $88.14. No rhyme. Maybe it was an oversight, I said aloud to an empty house. Except I kept finding more. There was a Rite Aid run listed as meeting supplies on a Sunday, a lift to a hotel in South Park on a Wednesday at 11:58 p.m., client site visit, she'd scrawled, and a matching return at 6:21 a.m. I stared at the ink until the numbers blurred and the decimal points looked like eyes. I didn't print that one. I photographed it, then opened voice memos and recorded myself saying the date and amounts. North Carolina is one-party consent. It had been a trivia fact in my head since some safety meeting where we learned to document incidents. It meant I could record conversations I was a part of without announcing it, and I could record myself to keep a chain of custody of what I'd seen when I saw it. By 10:56 p.m., when the garage door finally rumbled and the back door creaked, I had a manila folder labeled March, dinner, and a list of 6 dates cross-checked with deposits. I had what looked less like infidelity and more like a habit of mislabeling, double-dipping, or both. It wasn't a sexy story. It was a fraud story. Ariel had the look of someone who had been kissed recently and then powdered over with peppermint gum. She set her purse down too carefully and looked through me as if searching for her own reflection in glass. "Hey," she said, "you're up." "I smell lobster," I said. She rubbed her wrist, the way she always did when a lie needed to pass through her bloodstream faster. "We had the tasting menu," she said. "New client from Raleigh. Chris needed me there." "Tell Chris I still want my shirt back," I said again, softer this time, almost a whisper, not for her but for the room, like writing on a wall. She tilted her head. "Why are you on about a shirt?" "Because I keep things," I said, and lifted the manila folder. "Do you?" Her eyes flicked down to the tab and back up. I could see the fork in her, fight or minimize. She chose the smaller knife. "You've been going through our statements again." "I'm tracking household spending," I said, "also tracking what looks like a pattern." "What pattern?" "The pattern where a lift to the Cottingham Hotel at 11:58 p.m. becomes a site visit." She closed her eyes. "Do not do this." "I'm not doing anything," I said. "I'm collecting receipts. If there's a good explanation, I want to write it down next to the expenses so when we talk to anyone who asks, the story matches the math." "Anyone who asks. Your company, or mine, or a mediator, or a judge." I let that hang, not to threaten but to get honest. She folded her arms. "You think you can scare me with paperwork?" "I think paperwork scares people who told the same lie to 2 different rooms," I said. But then her mouth twitched, not in fear but in anger, and I realized what she was about to do. She would accuse me of control. She would flip the board. "I'm allowed to have a career," she said, "to have client dinners. Chris is my boss. He trusts me." "I noticed," I said before I could stop myself. "He also trusts our shirt." She grabbed her purse again like a shield, moved past me into the hall, and the air filled with the smell of her perfume, that winter citrus scent with a vanilla afterthought. She shut the bedroom door harder than she meant to. The house settled around the sound. I didn't sleep. I wrote down the dates of every out-of-office dinner she'd mentioned in the last 6 months. I wrote down the time I'd picked her up once and she'd asked me to drop her 2 blocks from our house because she said, "It looks more professional if I'm not seen." I wrote a name, HR, compliance. I wrote a number, labor commissioner, whistleblower hotline. I wrote, IRS form 3949A. I didn't know if I'd need it. I wanted to know it existed. By Saturday morning, I had a draft email addressed to a person whose title I had to look up, Director of Internal Audit. I didn't hit send. Not yet. I also had a new notebook labeled House because my worst-case planning brain had grown 2 sizes overnight. I walked the perimeter of the house with my phone camera and recorded the condition of everything that could be called marital property if this turned into a wall of stamped pages. The West Elm sofa Ariel loved, the KitchenAid mixer, the framed print from our honeymoon in Maine. If there was a breakup of assets later, I wanted a baseline, not a screaming match. On Sunday, she made pancakes like she was auditioning for a commercial and asked if we could not talk about that weird vibe we'd had. I said we could table it until Tuesday. She blinked. Why Tuesday? Because that's when you told me the dinner was, I said, and watched the syrup drag a line across the plate like a pen. On Monday, something interesting happened at work at the shop in the Belmont neighborhood where we staged materials for fit-outs. A package came for me, 2 shirts I'd ordered from a brand I like because the fabric doesn't wrinkle in a hot attic. The color of one was called Harbor. When I slid it out, I understood how a shirt could undo a person. It was the exact shade of the shirt Chris borrowed at the lake. It wasn't evidence, it was a way to bait a hook. I took a late lunch and drove uptown to the Seaforth. I asked the bartender if they could print a copy of Thursday's credit card receipt for a table under Chris's last name, Kellerman, because I'd spilled coffee on ours and wanted to keep it for expense records. You would be surprised how many restaurant managers do not want to fight a polite man with a wedding ring and a receipt number. I left with 2 pieces of paper. One had the line, 2 lobsters, MP, 2 martinis, 1 bottle of Rombauer creme brulee espresso. The other had the gratuity, 22%, signed by Chris with a sharp, confident V in the middle of his last name. There was space on the line for client. It was blank, except the timestamp had a second line I hadn't expected. 10:51 p.m., Amex, same last 4 as Ariel's corporate card. Pre-auth $100 for after lounge. I knew enough from fit-out budgets to know after lounge is the kind of euphemism that becomes a line item no one questions until an auditor with a fresh degree decides to make partner. I sat with it. I imagined a hearing where a panel asked questions in unison and I slid documents across a table like a dealer. I imagined a divorce hearing where numbers spoke louder than one trembling voice. I wasn't fantasizing. I was rehearsing. When I got home, I found the blue Harbor shirt and put it on a hanger in the hall. I wanted to see who flinched first. That night, Ariel came home early with a small smile like a promise. "We're going to Asheville this weekend," she said. "Work retreat. Not a big thing. I'll be back Sunday." "Which hotel?" I asked. "The Foundry," she said without hesitation, which means she'd said it out loud to herself earlier to prepare. "Nice bar," I said, and lifted the hanger like it was nothing. "You think I should bring this to Chris? Save him a trip?" Her eyes found the shirt and then me. That's when I saw fear for the first time, honest, bright, animal fear. She tried to cover it with offense. "You have to stop. This is obsessive. What's at the Foundry besides colleagues?" I asked. "Let me guess, team building, a scavenger hunt, a panel called Authenticity at Scale." "You don't know my world," she said. "I know numbers," I said. "I also know what it looks like when a married woman stops paying her share of the Duke energy bill because she's paying for hotel bars that don't put client names on lines." She stepped back like I had pushed her. "You think you're the only person who sacrifices?" she said, voice shaking now for real. "Do you know how many nights I've smiled through men talking about sports I don't watch? Do you know how many times I've made myself smaller to get a signature on a contract so you can build your little shelves without worrying?" "I build the shelves because they hold things," I said. "You build rooms to eat in, then forget what's on the table." We didn't speak for the rest of the night. The word divorce didn't enter the room. It stood on the porch, fogging the glass. On Wednesday, I sent 2 emails. The first went to Ariel's director of internal audit, with a subject line that used the boring language auditors love: potential expense policy violations, third-party documentation available. I attached scans of receipts that were ours and reimbursements that were theirs with dates that never matched. I did not mention infidelity. I mentioned control numbers and missing client names. I offered to discuss on a call. The second email went to a family law mediator in Charlotte that a coworker recommended when his brother had a clean but ugly separation. I did not schedule anything. I asked about discovery timelines. I asked if marital waste could be documented by patterns of corporate expense fraud when the other spouse used joint funds. The assistant responded in under an hour, "Yes. Keep your records. Photograph everything. Do not confront in a way that could be interpreted as coercive. If you feel your access to joint funds is threatened, consider a temporary freeze." She included a $250 consultation quote. I added it to a page I'd titled, "Retainer." By Friday, I had another message, but not from Ariana. It came from a compliance analyst at her company. They wanted to schedule an interview with me to provide context for the documentation I'd provided. It was set for Monday, March 20th at 10 a.m. via Teams. I wrote the date. I underlined it. Ariel left for Asheville on Saturday morning in a black blazer that was not designed to keep anyone warm. I watched from the kitchen window as she pulled out, my coffee cooling in my hand. When the taillights disappeared, I took the harbor shirt off the hanger, folded it, and put it in a gallon Ziploc. I wasn't going to give Chris anything back. I was going to keep everything he didn't know he'd left behind. At noon, I drove to a UPS store and rented a P.O. box. I changed my bank alerts so duplicates went to an email tied to that box's account. Next, I opened a new, no-fee checking account in my name only and set up a partial automatic transfer from my paycheck, $300 a week, to that account. Not to hide money, but to pad the floor I might soon stand on alone. Then I went home and backed up every photo in our shared iCloud, twice. But then, at 3:17 p.m. my phone buzzed with a credit card alert. The Foundry, bar, $124.80. I didn't smile. I wrote the time. At 5:09 p.m., Lyft, $38.44. At 11:05 p.m., Lyft, $12.22. The return did not match the origin. I drew arrows until the page looked like football plays. On Sunday, at 8:02 a.m., I got an email from Internal Audit. They were expanding their review. They said this sentence, which I reread 4 times, there may be additional issues beyond what you initially flagged that intersect with your household. That told me 2 things. My documents had teeth, and someone had stepped on them. Ariel came home at 2:30 p.m. with a tote bag that looked too light. She kissed my cheek like a polite cousin and asked if I'd eaten lunch. I said no, which was true. We ate on opposite ends of the same counter. When we finished, she said, "We need to talk." I pressed start on the dishwasher and put my phone face down on the counter. The voice memo app was recording. "I'm under review at work," she said. "Someone sent in something." "A dossier," I said. Neat word she swallowed. "They're saying my expenses don't align. Do they?" I asked. She stared at the window behind me like the answer might be written in the condensation. "Sometimes I used our card and submitted because my corporate card was maxed for the month," she said. "Chris said it was fine." "Chris doesn't sign the checks," I said. "Also, he's the one who called the Lyft at 11:58 p.m., right? Hard to submit a site visit when your driver says downtown hotel." She flinched. "There was a client whose flight got canceled. What was the client's name?" Her mouth opened, then closed. "It was more complicated than that." "It always is," I said. "That's why policies are written the way they are, to turn complicated into simple." She looked tired for the first time, not defensive. "Are you going to leave me?" she asked. The truth was, I didn't know. The other truth was, that wasn't the next step. The next step was to protect the house, the savings, and whatever part of my self-respect I could still staple to the wall. "I'm going to stop co-signing your stories," I said. On Monday at 10 a.m., I logged into Teams 10 minutes early. Internal Audit came on with 2 people whose faces looked like they believed in binders. They asked calm questions. I gave calm answers. I showed receipts where joint funds covered corporate costs with no reimbursement and where after-hours bars claimed anonymous clients who never returned emails. I did not accuse Ariel of sleeping with Chris. I didn't need to. I accused numbers of not adding up. At the end, the director said, "We appreciate your cooperation. We may have to talk again." I said I'd be available. I felt my hands shake only after I clicked leave. By Wednesday, Ariel was on paid administrative leave. She sat at the kitchen table scrolling emails with the frozen expression of someone holding a glass that might crack. She didn't lash out. She didn't apologize. She just kept reading like there was a line in there that would change the plot if she found it. I met with the mediator that afternoon. We talked about temporary orders, how to ensure the mortgage was paid, how to divide expenses, how to keep a freeze on discretionary spending until the review at her company finished. The mediator said something I wrote down. Marital waste isn't about catching someone on a date. It's about documenting how community funds were misused without consent and how that affected the balance sheet. It was the least romantic sentence I'd ever admired. But then, on Friday, March 31st, a certified letter arrived from Ariel's company. It was addressed to her, but she was upstairs, and I was the one who signed. She came down the stairs like each step was a negotiation. She took the letter and opened it with a paring knife. I watched her read the first paragraph, then the second. The knife clicked on the counter. "They terminated me," she said, very quietly, "for cause." I asked if she wanted water. She shook her head. Her eyes were red and clear at the same time, like a warning light. She handed me the letter. It said what letters like that always say: violations of expense policy, failure to maintain accurate records, conflict of interest concerns pending further review. There was a line about severance being withheld. There was a line about repayment of certain reimbursements totaling $12,486.32. That number was a shape I recognized. I'd added other numbers and come close. She sat and stared at the floors I'd sanded. "What happens now?" she asked. "Now we make a plan," I said. "So we don't burn down the house because we left a candle too close to a curtain." In April, I filed for separation. We agreed on a temporary schedule for the house and the bills, and I documented every transfer like it was a tiny trial. I also filed a small claim against Chris for an unpaid personal loan of property because I wanted him in a room where an officer of the court said his name with a title. The shirt wasn't worth the filing fee. The point was, the hearing date was set for May 24th in Mecklenburg County Small Claims Court. The room was fluorescent and impatient. When our case was called, Chris walked up in a jacket that was trying too hard and smiled like he was doing the bailiff a favor. He looked at me and said, "This is petty, man." "That's one word for it," I said, and handed the magistrate a packet. On top was a color photo of the Harbor shirt and the receipt from Larkin Ledger for dry cleaning a different shirt Chris had returned to me as if I wouldn't notice the buttons. Under that was a sworn affidavit I'd written, and under that, because I believed in momentum, was a letter from Ariel's former company describing their determination and the amount due back. I said nothing about sex. I said everything about custody of things. The magistrate asked Chris if he'd borrowed a shirt. He shrugged. "It was a party. Did you return the same shirt you borrowed?" He smiled a little too big. "I returned a shirt." The magistrate nodded once. He awarded me the value of the shirt at purchase, $78, plus court costs, $96, plus a $25 service fee because Chris hadn't shown for the first notice. A small number. But the judgment was a line in a database, and I wanted it there. Something I could send to his HR with the subject line, "Court record regarding property integrity." I did, attaching the PDF before I left the courthouse steps. June brought heat and the kind of rain that looks personal. It also brought the meeting I'd been building toward. Ariel's company scheduled a restitution conference. They wanted to formalize the repayment plan and close their file. The company's counsel sat across from us at a long table with a pitcher of water no one touched. Ariel's new lawyer breathed through his nose like a runner at mile 20. I had my folder. The counsel read the total again. $12,486.32, due within 90 days, with a signed agreement that there would be no rehire eligibility and that any future verification calls would reflect termination for cause. There was also a clause about an additional review of potential improper relationships affecting vendor selection and supervision, a soft phrase that could harden if pushed. Ariel's lawyer asked if a payment plan could be arranged. The counsel said yes, $3,000 up front, 3 monthly payments of $3,162.11, and a final transfer of $2,000 on day 90 to close. The math surprised me. I checked it in my head and in my notebook anyway. It held. I slid an envelope across the table. Inside was a cashier's check for $3,000 from Ariel's personal savings, not from our joint account. I'd made sure of that. The counsel checked the amount, initialed the first page of the agreement, and pushed the rest toward Ariel. She signed. The sound of the pen on paper was a small storm. After we left, she stood with me in the parking lot under a humidity that made the air feel like soup. "I'm sorry," she said. "It wasn't loud. It wasn't public. It didn't fix anything. But it landed on a shelf that had been empty a long time." "I know," I said, and meant two things at once. The divorce petition followed in July. We opted for equitable distribution, and my file cabinet turned into a map. The mediator looked at my logs and said, "You did your homework." He meant it kindly. The settlement conference, in early September, was the showdown I'd rehearsed 100 times in my head, but only once on paper. We sat on opposite sides of a conference room at a neutral office space near South Park Mall. The carpet was bland. The coffee was better than I expected. We negotiated the house. We negotiated the car title. We negotiated the dog, which we didn't have, because the mediator said it helped to imagine where conflict would go if it had fur. What mattered most to me were two lines that would live in black and white, that the $12,486.32 restitution Ariel owed to her former employer would be treated as her non-marital debt because it arose from her conduct, and that any future claims by that employer related to her tenure, civil or otherwise, would be her responsibility. In exchange, I agreed not to pursue spousal support even though my lawyer told me I could try for a small award. It took 8 hours and 3 sandwiches brought in from a deli that didn't deserve the tension in that room. At 5:42 p.m., we signed the Memorandum of Understanding. I took a photo of the clock because I wanted to remember the exact minute I put down the weight I'd carried since March 9. But then a new weight slid in, quiet, the kind that doesn't announce itself, the kind that sits on your couch and watches the door. 2 weeks later, I got a certified letter of my own. It was from the IRS, acknowledging receipt of a Form 30,949A related to Ariel, last name, reimbursement practices. It said that they do not provide status updates. It thanked me for my attention to tax compliance. I didn't feel triumphant reading it. I felt like a man who had rung a bell and was walking away before the sound stopped. In October, Ariel moved into a one-bedroom near Freedom Park. She took the West Elm sofa and the frame print from Maine. I kept the shelves and the mixer. I boxed the Harbor shirt and placed it in the crawl space above the attic stairs where cool air hangs even in summer. It wasn't a trophy. It was a page from a ledger I no longer had to update. I saw Chris once more, in December, at a coffee place. He was with a new hire, teaching him how to stand in a line like it was a stage. He looked past me, then glanced back, then looked past me again. I could have said something. I didn't. I didn't need another judgment number. I already had the ones that mattered. On January 3, 2024, the divorce order was entered. The clerk stamped it with a thud that sounded like a book closing. The line about Ariel's restitution and debt sat there, plain and specific. The order about the house did too. I ran my finger along the bottom edge of the copy until I realized the paper could cut me if I pressed any harder. The house felt different that first night. Not empty exactly, more like it had returned to its original language and was teaching it to me room by room. I opened the front door, the marine blue changing shades in the streetlight, and stood there long enough to feel the cold on my knees. Somewhere down the block, a dog barked once, twice, then gave up. I thought of the first hook I'd thrown, the text about lobster and a shirt, and how fast fear announces truth when you strike the right nerve. I thought of numbers and how they'll save you if you let them, if you write them down before they move. I washed a single plate. I dried it and put it on the shelf I'd built. I turned off the kitchen light and listened for the tick of the stove clock as it counted another small, exact thing I could hold.